Hello, welcome to Voices for Justice. My name is Sharon Racusin. The focus of this show is to give voice to all the social, economic, and environmental justice work that's being done in the Upper Valley, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and to highlight how each issue is connected to the other. Ultimately, I'd like to promote the need to work together for the common good, for our human rights, and for the planet. At the end of each episode, there will be some contact information, and I urge you to get involved. Enjoy the show. Hello. This is the Voices for Justice show, and I'm Sharon Racusin, the host. And with me today is Becca Gurel, the pastor from the Lebanon United Methodist Church in Lebanon. Welcome, Becca, to the show. And today we're just going to have a short discussion on homelessness. And before the show, we were talking about the ordinance, the Lebanon ordinance, which has come and gone, it's passed. And I know, Becca, that you were very opposed to it, to the ordinance per se. And I thought maybe you'd like to, we can discuss what was wrong with it.
Sure. Thanks for having me on your show, Sharon. I'm excited to talk about housing and homelessness in our community. My concern about the ordinance that the Lebanon City Council did pass a week or so ago is that I think it doesn't really address or get to the problem that we have in our community, which is not about where people camp or park, but is about a lack of housing, available, affordable, accessible housing. And so when the City Council first took up this ordinance and had a public hearing and decided not to take action on the ordinance, but to create a task force, that task force did some really great work over the summer and into the fall, housing people. And they did that without an ordinance in place. They did not need that ordinance in order to affect the changes that they were hoping to affect by working directly with people. But that task force brought together social service organizations and efforts and really focused on getting people into housing. That really is what is needed. That's the solution to the housing crisis and to the homelessness that we are seeing in our town, in our community, in our region, is to increase the housing availability and help people access those resources. So by passing an ordinance, I don't think that we have done much to address the long-term problem. I don't think anybody is under the illusion that this ordinance addresses that long-term problem of lack of housing. My understanding from the council and from the police force is that they see it as a tool to move people toward housing, and it gives the police department some ways of interacting with people other than arrest to move folk toward housing. I just don't think that it's an effective tool, and I don't think it's a necessary one. So that's kind of my first concern about the ordinance.
Yeah. So when we were talking about the ordinance and we were talking about homelessness, I said something to the effect that there's a lot of deep root causes for homelessness. Housing is a solution. We do desperately, every community needs housing, affordable housing, whether it's for workforce or for people who don't have an income. I mean, we just need to take care of people, and that's really your job as a pastor. You think a lot about taking care of people, and you mentioned something that I think a lot about, and that's we as a community think that we're all a little bit fearful of being in the same position, of facing what really could be anybody, because we're all one paycheck away from a crisis sometimes. And those reasons could be health care. They could be your health care or someone in your family.
Right.
Lack of transportation, lack of a job. And so there's so many reasons. So when we know there are solutions, but there also has to be some help from the other end, helping people to live with dignity, right? And
Yeah, and I think it's a comprehensive problem, and so there's going to be comprehensive solutions, not any one magic cure or silver bullet or something like that that can really build the resiliency in an individual's life and in the life of our community that would keep people housed. It is true that most of us are one or two crises away from losing our housing, our employment, any number of things, and they're all layered on top of each other. So transportation is a great example where often our transportation and our job are linked. If you don't have the means to get to your job, to work, you might not have the means to fill the car with gas, or you might not be able to pay the rent that keeps you close to the advanced transit line so that you can get to your job. And it kind of creates this vicious cycle where when one of those kind of pillars of your life that's holding it together wobbles or falls, the whole thing can come crashing down. So we see all these intersecting concerns about housing, substance abuse, medical concerns and conditions, legal concerns and conditions, transportation, and employment, just swirling together in this. We're trying to keep all of these things afloat. We're trying to juggle all of these pieces. And so when something falls, the whole system can kind of collapse. And I think on one level, some of us forget that we are vulnerable ourselves to this same collapse, and it could happen very easily in my life, in your life, with somebody's medical need suddenly becoming a huge crisis, and at the same time there's a job loss, or there's a legal problem or something that intersects with that. On the other hand, I think we might be aware that we're that vulnerable, and that's really an uncomfortable place to be. Yeah, maybe if we can push some of the folk who remind us of our vulnerability out of sight, that we wouldn't have to look quite so closely at our own fear about that. And quite often when you have conversation with people without work, without housing, without access to transportation, you'll find that it's a cliche to say, there but for the grace of God go we. Even as a spiritual person, I think there's more to it than that. But that it could very easily be any one of us, and that in a real sense it is me that doesn't have housing, it is me that doesn't have employment, it is me that doesn't have access to transportation, and that can't get out of that cycle. We need each other to hold the system together and to hold one another up.
Right.
That's really, as a person of faith and as a faith leader, where I see sort of the moral voice is in reminding us of our responsibility for one another and to one another, and how we are charged with the care of each other in the system. Again, going back to the ordinance that was passed by the City Council, I don't think that the City Council or the police force is incompassionate or do not feel that they have a sense of responsibility to one another. They feel that very deeply. We disagree about the means and how we go about that. To me, this ordinance feels that it feels like it's not getting to some of those root causes. It's not addressing sustainability. And so it doesn't feel like it's the right way to go about addressing it. I don't think that the people who supported it or who approved it do so from a place of malice at all.
Right. I agree with you, yeah. It struck me, even from the beginning, that even though we have a border of the Connecticut River dividing our two communities, Lebanon and West Lebanon and Hartford, we are essentially one very big community, and it never felt like the issue that was being addressed of the lack of housing and homelessness in the Hannaford area had anything to do with any surrounding area. It was kind of strange in a way that, and people did bring it up, saying, if you criminalize homelessness in this way by fining people, they're going to pack up the little belongings they have and go to Hartford or go to somewhere else, and that problem will just be replicated somewhere else. And it never seemed to, it never felt like anyone actually heard that, even though I'm sure that they did. We know the Haven is in Hartford.
Right.
but that, that seems to be the only link to Lebanon. But meanwhile, people have been camping in the woods of Hartford for a very long time, and the surrounding area, as Bev McKinley pointed out. These are people who stay out of, focus. They're in the background. They tend to not want to be known, yet they take the bus with us. They shop with us. They get nice clothing from the charitable organizations that are around. But this ordinance brought it into focus.
Yeah, and some of the response brought it into focus too, like the task force that the council created this summer, because that did bring together people from Listen Community Services and from the Haven, both of which are located, or at least their primary physical locations are in Hartford and across the river, because we do function as an ecosystem. There are not shelters and services in quite the same way in Lebanon itself. This is one of the challenges to the ordinance, is that if the community doesn't provide the resources for its residents, that it is not fair or right for that community to criminalize the actions or to fine the actions that would that people need to take in order to survive within the community. That just pushes the burden into neighboring communities. But we also need to recognize it's not that the burden is pushed into neighboring communities, but that we share together the responsibility for one another as a community. And that does mean that there's stronger connections formed between human services within Lebanon, for example, and the Haven. And that's something that the task force really did and really strengthened. And moving forward, the city of Lebanon is in conversation and remains in relationship through Lynn Goodwin, the human services coordinator for the city, with a whole range of people, including folks from the Haven and Listen and Silent Warriors, and then including a whole bunch of concerned citizens who want to continue this conversation about housing. And I think part of what's really going to help make a difference here is looking at it as a big picture, as a community, so that we can share that responsibility for each other. It gives me some hope, this conversation about the ordinance, really, because we see how strongly the community of Lebanon and of the Upper Valley came together in this conversation to say, whether we agree for this ordinance as a way forward, we agree that something more needs to be done. It needs to be comprehensive, and we want to be a part of this solution, or these solutions, because I think there will be many.
And when I think of comprehensive solutions, I think rolling the camera backwards in each person's story and seeing what the cause is, because if we don't address those causes, we will always have an acute homeless problem and other issues, healthcare issues and everything that creates a burden, an extreme burden on people. And so if I had, my wish to make a better world, what world would I like to live in? It would be one that took care of people from the very beginning of their life, and at least help them to make, to help them with the challenges that go along with humanity, I guess.
Right.
And in this country, we don't do a good job. So we've got problems in every community, but we have problems in the state, as you look, widen the lens, it goes right up to the federal government who our Congress refuses to take care of people. And I believe in charitable organizations, but the charitable organizations and the churches are really bearing the burden.
Right, and it gets overwhelming. I mean, you start to see it at that big picture, huge picture level of our national or global failures to care for one another, and it's incredibly overwhelming. But as you're also pointing out, the solutions or the ways forward are going to be incredibly specific and incredibly individualized. What helps one person attain and maintain housing is not going to help the person literally in the next tent over, right? Because each person's circumstance is unique. It's those pieces of their history, those intersecting things that are happening in their lives
Right.
that need to be addressed and need to be dealt with sustainably in order for housing to be a possibility for this person, in order for housing to remain a possibility for someone. It's much easier in some ways to get into housing than it is to stay in housing. Quite often there are barriers that keep us from remaining in a stable place. So our approach, I feel, needs to be really specific, and it needs to be driven by the individual in need of housing, not by the social service organization, not by the religious organization, not by the city or the human services organization, but by that individual. What do you need to be housed? And what one person needs in terms of accessibility and affordability and location and privacy versus living in a community with other people is going to be wildly different from someone else. So it's really easy to get overwhelmed by the big picture, but when we come down to it, we're talking about a person-by-person approach to finding and maintaining housing. And what's wonderful about our community, I think, as interconnected as we are on different sides of the river, different states, it's also not a huge community. And so there's almost a point at which we reach a list of people that we know who are without housing. I don't think this is an insurmountable task before us as the Upper Valley, and certainly as the city of Lebanon. If we can increase housing stock and availability, we're at about 1% vacancy. We need to be at about 4% vacancy at any given time to have enough housing for the residents of our community. If we can increase our housing stock and then work with people person by person, I think we can effectively end homelessness and house nearly our entire community. Of course, new folk will always be becoming homeless and new folk will always be entering housing, but that we can be really close to a place where homelessness is not a pressing crisis in our community because we are housing one another and we are caring for our community. And that's the hope and the vision. I think it's attainable.
I would love to be as optimistic as you are. I really would. But I want to thank you so much for being here during this busy time of your season. And we've promised each other that we're going to have another discussion similar to this one, but just as deep and wonderful. Thank you for your graciousness.
Well, thank you for this conversation, this time of year and any time of year. It's really important, and just important that we stay engaged as a community. So thank you.
Thanks.
Let's do that.
Okay.